And now we're going to look at voting rights. The main idea is that in the 1960s, African Americans gained voting rights and political power in the South, but only after a bitter and hard-fought struggle. Our learning objectives is to summarize the efforts to expand voting rights for African Americans. Voting rights for African Americans were achieved at great human cost and sacrifice. President Kennedy was worried about the violent reactions to the nonviolent methods of the civil rights movement. Attorney General Robert Kennedy urged SNCC leaders to focus on voter registration rather than on protest. He promised that the federal government would protect civil rights workers if they focused on voter registration. The 24th Amendment outlawed the practice of taxing citizens to vote. Hundreds of thousands of people volunteered to spend their summers registering African Americans to vote. So, registering voters. SNCC, CORE, and other groups founded the Voter Education Project, or VEP, to register Southern African Americans to vote. Opposition to African American suffrage was great. Mississippi was particularly hard. VEP workers lived in daily fear for their safety. The VEP was a success. By 1964, they had registered more than 500,000 more African American voters. The 24th Amendment. Congress passed the 24th Amendment in August of 1962. The amendment banned states from taxing citizens to vote, for example, poll taxes. It applied only to elections for president or Congress. Freedom Summer. Hundreds of college students volunteered to spend the summer registering African Americans to vote. The project was called Freedom Summer. Most of the trainers were from poor Southern African American families. Most of the volunteers were white, Northern, and upper middle class. Volunteers registered voters or taught at summer schools. And then we had a crisis in the state of Mississippi when Andrew Goodman, a Freedom Summer volunteer, went missing on June 21, 1964. Goodman and 2 CORE workers had gone to inspect a church that had recently been bombed. President Johnson ordered a massive hunt for the 3 men. Their bodies were discovered near Philadelphia, Mississippi. 21 suspects were tried in federal court for violating civil rights laws. The results of the Project Freedom Summer. The organizers considered Mississippi's Freedom Summer Project a success. The Freedom Schools taught 3,000 students. More than 17,000 African Americans in Mississippi applied to vote. State elections officials accepted only about 1,600 of the 17,000 applications, so less than 10%. This showed that a federal law was needed to secure voting rights for African Americans. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders wanted to help President Johnson defeat Republican Barry Goldwater in the 1964 presidential election. These leaders agreed to suspend their protest until after Election Day. SNCC leaders refused, saying they wanted to protest segregation within the Democratic Party. SNCC helped to form the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. They elected 68 delegates to the Democratic National Convention and asked to be seated instead of the all-white delegations sent by the state's Democratic Party. Fannie Lou Hamer told the convention's Credentials Committee that why the MFDP group should represent Mississippi. President Johnson ordered a compromise. 2 members of the MFDP delegation would be seated, and the rest would be non-seated guests of the convention. The NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference supported the compromise. SNCC and the MFDP rejected the compromise. The MFDP's challenge failed in the end, and it also helped widen a split that was developing in the civil rights movement. The Voting Rights Act, the Selma campaign. King organized marches in Selma, Alabama to gain voting rights for African Americans. King and many other marchers were jailed. Police attacked a march in Marion, and King announced a 4-day march from Selma to Montgomery. 600 African Americans began a 54-mile march. City and state police blocked their way out of Selma. TV cameras captured police using clubs, chains, and electric cattle prods on the marchers. The Voting Rights Act. President Johnson asked for and received a tough voting rights law. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed in Congress with large majorities, and it proved to be one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation ever passed.